It was a crisp Chicago night in the late 1920s when Al Capone, known to his enemies and admirers alike as Scarface, found himself in a predicament that would test even his notorious ingenuity. The city was his, a sprawling tapestry of speakeasies, gambling dens and brothels, all under the watchful eye of the man who had risen from the streets of Brooklyn to become the king of the Chicago underworld. Capone sat in his opulent office, the walls lined with dark wood and adorned with paintings, a sharp contrast to the gritty reality outside. His desk was a fortress of paperwork, but his mind was elsewhere. The feds had been closing in, and tonight they were set to raid one of his biggest operations, the Four Deuces, a speakeasy and gambling joint in the heart of Chicago's Levee District. The plan was simple, or so it seemed. Capone had arranged for his men to be tipped off in time to evacuate the premises, but there was one catch. The informant was a man known only as the Whisper, whose reliability was as thin as the smoke that curled from Capone's cigar. As the clock ticked towards midnight, Capone's trusted lieutenant, Frank the Enforcer Nitti, burst into the room, his face a mask of urgency. "Boss, we got trouble. The Whisper didn't show. The feds are going to hit the Four Deuces any minute now," Nitti gasped out, his breath a visible cloud in the cold air. Capone's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to lose the Four Deuces. It was more than just a business, it was a statement of his power. He stood, his large frame filling the room, his presence alone a force to be reckoned with. "We don't run," Capone declared, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "We fight, but not with guns tonight, Frank. We use our heads." He scribbled something on a piece of paper, handed it to Nitti. "Get this to Jimmy, tell him to do exactly what's written, and make sure our people inside know the drill." Nitti left, confusion etched on his face, but knowing better than to question Al Capone. Capone donned his coat, the one with the concealed pockets for his weapons, and made his way to the Four Deuces. The streets were quiet, the night air thick with the promise of danger. He arrived just as the federal agents were setting up their perimeter, but instead of seeing a bustling den of vice, they found a church service in full swing. Inside, the speakeasy had transformed. Tables were now makeshift pews, and the bar was an altar. Women, known for their dealings in Capone's establishments, wore simple dresses, their hair pinned up, singing hymns with a fervor that would make any pastor proud. Capone's men, including Jimmy, were dressed as ushers, distributing hymn books that were, in fact, disguised ledgers of the night's dealings. Capone himself sat in the back, a Bible in hand, the very picture of a repentant man seeking solace in the Word of God. The federal agents, led by a young, eager Elliot Ness, burst in, expecting to catch Capone red-handed. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a prayer. Ness, flabbergasted, watched as Capone rose, his face the very image of surprise. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you in the house of the Lord?" Capone asked, his voice echoing in the now silent room. Ness, aware of the legal implications of raiding a church without just cause, was caught in a bind. "We have information this place was operating illegally," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Capone gestured around. "You see any signs of that now, Mr. Ness? We're just humble folks trying to find our way." The agents searched, but all they found were religious texts, hymnals, and a congregation that seemed genuinely upset by the intrusion. With no evidence of illegal activity, Ness had no choice but to retreat, his team leaving with nothing but their pride bruised. Once the feds were gone, Capone stood, his laughter filling the room. "All right, show's over, back to work," he commanded, and within moments, the church service dissolved back into the night's real business. Later, in a back room, Capone sat with Nitti and Jimmy, the tension easing with each sip of whiskey. "You did good, Jimmy. That was some quick thinking." Jimmy, a wiry man with a knack for theatrics, grinned. "Thanks, boss. But what do we do about the Whisper? He's gonna pay for this." Capone leaned back, the ice in his glass clinking. "We deal with him, but not tonight. Tonight, we celebrate. We outsmarted the feds, and that's worth a toast." The night wore on, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses mingling with the jazz that once again filled the Four Deuces. But beneath the revelry, Capone's mind was calculating. The Whisper had crossed him, and in Al Capone's Chicago, that was a death sentence. However, he knew there would be time for that. For now, he had won another round in the endless game of cat and mouse with the law. As dawn approached, Capone left the Four Deuces, the city waking up to another day under his rule. He had walked free again, not just from the raid, but from the shadow of doubt that had briefly clouded his empire. In the heart of Chicago, Al Capone was more than a man. He was a legend, and legends, as everyone knew, were hard to take down. But Capone knew better than anyone that every victory was temporary. Every move in the game of power could be your last. He walked the streets back to his home, his mind on the next steps. The Whisper needed to be dealt with, but he also had to ensure his operations were more secure, less vulnerable to betrayal. Back at his mansion, Capone sat down at his desk, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid a mirror to his thoughts. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Jack, we need to talk," Capone said into the receiver, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jack Machine Gun McGurn, his enforcer for such delicate matters, was on the other end. "Got it, boss. What's the play?" McGurn's voice was steady, the sound of a man who had seen it all. "The Whisper. Find him and make an example. No more loose ends," Capone ordered, his voice cold. After hanging up, Capone leaned back in his chair, contemplating the chessboard of his life. He had outsmarted Ness tonight, but the game was far from over. The federal government, with its endless resources, would keep coming. His empire was built on sand, and he needed to fortify it, not just against the law, but against traitors within his ranks. He lit a cigar, the smoke swirling upwards, a symbol of his contemplation. Capone knew he had to diversify, to find new ways to launder money, new fronts for his operations. The speakeasies were lucrative, but risky. He needed to look into legitimate businesses, to blend into the fabric of society where the law couldn't easily reach. As the morning light grew stronger, Capone made his plans. He would expand into real estate, perhaps even dabble in politics. After all, everyone had a price, and in Chicago, Al Capone knew where to find the leverage. The night he had outsmarted the feds would not be his last, but it was a reminder to stay one step ahead, always. With the city stirring awake, Capone felt the weight of his empire on his shoulders, but also the thrill of the challenge. He was Al Capone, Scarface, the untouchable. And as long as he could play the game, he would keep walking free.